Here is a number that should stop you cold. $1. That is what it costs the United States Navy to fire its newest weapon. Not $100, not $1,000, $1. And that single dollar can reach out across the ocean and destroy a drone mid-flight, silently, invisibly, at the speed of light. Now hold that number in your head while I give you another one. $1.5 million. That is what a standard Navy interceptor missile costs every single time it fires. Every pull of the trigger, $1.5 million gone in a puff of smoke. And the drone it is shooting at? $20,000. Built from fiberglass, the kind of material you make cheap kayaks from. This is not just a financial problem. It is a math problem so dangerous that it nearly broke the entire concept of the aircraft carrier as the world's most powerful warship. And the solution is stranger than anything Hollywood would have dared to invent. An unmarked shipping container, quietly bolted to the flight deck of a $6 billion nuclear-powered carrier, sitting right there where the crew walks past every single day. Most of them had no idea what it was. On October 5, 2025, that shipping container came to life on the deck of the USS George H.W. Bush, the most powerful carrier in the United States fleet. In a live fire test that the Navy kept completely secret for nearly 7 months, a laser beam shot out of that box and burned multiple incoming drones right out of the sky. One after another. No noise, no smoke, no spent brass cartridges clattering across the deck. The drones just spiraled down into the Atlantic and disappeared. The Navy did not announce what happened until April of 2026, and when they did, it quietly rewrote the rules of naval warfare. So what exactly happened on that flight deck? Why did the Navy need a laser this badly? And why does a shipping container on a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier change the future of every Navy on Earth? Stick with me, because this story starts with a crisis that the Pentagon has been terrified about for years, and it only gets wilder from there. The bee problem. To understand why this laser matters so much, you need to understand the problem it was built to solve. And the best way to think about it is bees. Imagine you are standing in a field and a swarm of bees is coming at you. You happen to have a very fancy, very expensive fly swatter. The best fly swatter money can buy. It is perfectly accurate. Every swing connects. Every bee it hits goes down. But there are 500 bees, and after every swing, you have to buy a brand new fly swatter before you can swing again. And each replacement swatter costs $1.5 million. You will stop a lot of bees, but at some point you are going to run out of money faster than that hive runs out of bees. That is the exact problem that the United States Navy has been quietly panicking about for years. It even has a name inside the Pentagon. They call it the magazine depth problem. And it is the reason that the supercarrier, the most fearsome warship ever built, started looking dangerously fragile. Here is how naval defense has traditionally worked. When a threat appears on radar, the carrier's escort ships, the destroyers and cruisers surrounding the carrier, fire interceptor missiles at it. These missiles are extraordinary pieces of engineering. The evolved Sea Sparrow, which is one of the main ones in the Navy's playbook, flies at 4 times the speed of sound. It pulls turns that would flatten a fighter pilot. It almost never misses. But the world changed, and the Navy did not fully see it coming. Countries that could never afford to build a warship capable of going toe-to-toe with a U.S. carrier figured out something much smarter. They started building drones. Tiny, cheap, expendable drones. Not the sophisticated kind with radar systems and guided missiles. The dumb kind. Fiberglass bodies, small engines, a warhead packed in the nose, pointed in the direction of a target and released in massive numbers. Iran calls theirs the Shahed. Their factories can crank out thousands of them every single month. The strategy is brutal in its simplicity. You do not need one drone to succeed. You need enough drones that the defender runs out of missiles trying to shoot them all down. If you launch 200 cheap drones at a carrier strike group that has 100 interceptor missiles, you already know how that story ends. The math does the work for you, and the cost ratio makes it even more crushing. An Iranian attack drone can be built for somewhere between $1,000 and $20,000, depending on the model. An American interceptor missile costs between $1.5 million and $4 million per shot. So for every drone the Navy shoots down, it burns through an amount of money that could buy another 100 drones for the other side. The attacker keeps getting richer in ammunition, while the defender goes broke defending. And here's the part that really cements how serious this is. When a destroyer's missiles run dry, it cannot pull over at a harbor and reload. Restocking missile tubes on a warship at sea in a combat zone is so dangerous, it is essentially impossible. Once those tubes are empty, the whole strike group has to turn around and go home. The most powerful fleet on Earth, 5,000 sailors, 70 warplanes, billions of dollars of hardware, forced to retreat because someone ran out of a specific type of expensive tube-launched rockets. The deterrence, the sheer presence that makes America's enemies think twice, collapses. Not because anyone blew a hole in the carrier, but because of arithmetic. To see how real this threat became, look at what happened in the Red Sea starting in late 2023. The Houthi movement in Yemen, armed and supplied by Iran, began launching drone and missile attacks at commercial shipping and U.S. Navy warships. The destroyers defending those ships did exactly what they were trained to do. They fired interceptor missiles at incoming threats. Every engagement was technically a success. The missiles hit their targets. The drones went down. But the Navy watched its missile inventories shrink at a pace that alarmed analysts back in Washington. Destroyers that would normally never expend their defensive missiles at that rate were going through them fast enough that resupply schedules became a real logistical headache. The Houthis were not trying to sink ships directly. They were trying to bankrupt the defense, and it was working well enough that the Pentagon accelerated its search for a completely different kind of answer. Meanwhile, Iran was not the only country watching those engagements and taking notes. China studied every publicly available detail of what happened in the Red Sea. Their military planners could see the exact same math the Pentagon could see, and they started designing their drone programs accordingly. By 2026, China had already been developing specialized drone carrier ships capable of releasing dozens of aerial drones at once in coordinated swarm patterns. Their doctrine, which American analysts have gotten partial looks at through various intelligence assessments, involves saturating a carrier strike group from multiple directions and multiple altitude bands simultaneously, so the defensive radar has too many tracks to handle all at once. The Pentagon did not need a better missile. They needed to completely rethink what a bullet even was. The box on the flight deck. This is where the story gets genuinely surprising, because the answer the Navy came up with did not look like a weapon at all. The company that built it is called AeroVironment, and the system has one of the best acronyms in military history, LOCUST, which stands for Laser Optical Counter-UAS System for Tactical Use. Counter-UAS means Counter-Unmanned Aircraft System, which is just a complicated way of saying anti-drone. What makes LOCUST remarkable is not just what it does, it is how it was built, and what that decision reveals about how desperate the Navy's situation actually was. Building a new weapon system into a warship the traditional way takes years. When the Navy wanted to add a new radar system to its Arleigh Burke destroyers, the whole process required a hull redesign, a total structural rethink, and billions of dollars in shipyard work. Ships go into dry dock, their hulls get cut open, miles of new wiring get run through every compartment, software gets rebuilt from the ground up. It is a colossal undertaking that takes half a decade minimum. The USS George H.W. Bush was commissioned in 2009. It is not scheduled for its major overhaul, the kind where you could rip open the hull and do a proper deep integration, until the early 2030s. That is years away. And the drone swarm threat was already real, already happening, already proven in combat zones around the world. So AeroVironment did something completely different. They palletized the weapon. That means they took a full laser weapon system, the power source, the beam director, the targeting computers, everything, and they stuffed it inside a containerized unit that can be lifted onto a ship's deck by a standard forklift. It connects to the ship's power grid via cables. No hull cutting, no years of redesign, no dry dock. From power up to fully operational, 15 minutes. The Navy rolled it onto the George H.W. Bush's flight deck in October of 2025, and within days of arriving on the carrier, it was ready to shoot. One of the things the engineers were most nervous about was stability. A ship at sea is never perfectly still. It pitches forward and backward over swells. It rolls side to side. At any given moment, the deck beneath the laser is moving, and a laser beam that moves even slightly off target loses its dwell time. and has to reacquire. The targeting system has to compensate for the ship's movement constantly, hundreds of times per second, making tiny adjustments to keep the beam burning on exactly the same spot of the drone's airframe, while both the ship and the drone are moving at the same time. On October 5, 2025, in the Atlantic Ocean, the Locust did exactly that. It detected multiple drones, tracked them, accounted for the carrier's movement, and burned them down one after another. 100% success rate. The Navy sat on that information for 197 days before quietly announcing it alongside AeroVironment's press release in April of 2026. Now, laser weapons on warships were not totally new at that point. The Navy had tested other directed energy systems on destroyers and amphibious ships before. But what made the Bush test different, and why it was genuinely historic, is what was powering it. The USS George H.W. Bush runs on 2 nuclear reactors. Those reactors generate a staggering amount of electricity, far more than any conventional warship could ever hope to produce. Every other ship that had tested a laser was limited by how much power its engines could spare. A laser that wants to burn through a drone needs a lot of sustained electrical power, and a diesel-powered destroyer can only give it so much. A nuclear carrier has no such limit. By plugging Locust into the Bush's nuclear power grid, the engineers created something that had never existed before: a naval laser with an essentially unlimited energy supply. As long as the nuclear rods are hot, and they will be hot for years before they need replacing, the laser has ammunition. You cannot run it dry. It does not have a magazine. The only thing feeding it is 2 nuclear reactors doing what they were built to do. The cost per shot? Around $1 to $5. The cost of the electricity used to fire the beam. That is it. That is the entire price of shooting down a drone that would otherwise cost $1.5 million of missile to intercept. Flip the math from the beginning of this video. The original problem was spending $1.5 million to destroy a $20,000 drone. With Locust, you spend $5. The financial advantage just went from massively negative to almost incomprehensibly positive. The Navy flipped the equation completely. And the Navy was so confident in what happened that October that just a few months later, in March of 2026, AeroVironment unveiled the next version entirely: Locust X3. 3rd generation, AI-powered, even more precise. Still under $5 a shot, already ready for mass production. This thing moved fast. How a laser actually kills a drone. At this point, you might be picturing a sci-fi death ray that vaporizes a drone in a brilliant flash. The reality is both more subtle and more impressive. A missile kills by getting close to a target and blowing up. The explosion sends shrapnel in every direction. If a piece of shrapnel hits something critical on the drone or the wing or the engine, the target goes down. The kill is explosive and instant. A laser kills completely differently. It burns, slowly, precisely. It locks onto a target and holds a tightly focused beam on a single spot the size of a quarter. Not the whole drone, one tiny spot. And it holds that beam there for somewhere between 2 and 5 seconds. Think about what happens when you hold a magnifying glass over a leaf on a sunny day. Sunlight is not normally powerful enough to do much. But when you concentrate it through a lens onto one tiny point, that leaf catches fire. The laser is doing the same thing, except instead of sunlight coming through a magnifying glass, it is a 35 kilowatt beam of focused energy coming through a precision optical system powered by a nuclear reactor. When that beam hits the wing joint of an incoming drone, the fiberglass starts to soften. Then it buckles. The aerodynamics of the wing fall apart. The drone loses lift on that side, rolls, and spirals down into the ocean. No explosion, no shrapnel, no dramatic fireball. It just stops flying. This matters enormously for what is happening around the laser when it fires. On a flight deck, there are tens of millions of dollars worth of jet aircraft sitting on catapults waiting to launch. There are thousands of sailors moving around. There are engines sucking in enormous amounts of air. When the old last-ditch defense system, the Phalanx close-in weapon system, opens up, it fires 4,500 rounds of 20mm tungsten ammunition every minute. That is a lot of very fast, very hard metal flying around in every direction. Bits of shattered drone, spent casings, fragments of tungsten, all of it raining down on the flight deck, getting sucked into jet engines, landing on sailors. A laser produces none of that. There is no projectile, no cartridge, no shrapnel cloud. The beam travels at 186,000 miles per second, which is the speed of light, so there is no need to aim ahead of the target to account for travel time. The radar locks on and the beam connects, instantly, silently. There is also no smoke trail. When a missile launches, its rocket exhaust paints a bright line across the sky that every infrared sensor for miles around can see. It announces where the defender is, what direction the interceptor came from, and gives the attacker information about the ship's defensive posture. A laser leaves none of that. No exhaust plume, no radar bloom from a rocket igniting. The attack happens, and the only evidence is a drone tumbling out of the sky, with no explanation visible to anyone watching from a distance. The jets on the catapults can keep launching. The flight operations never stop. The carrier fights through an attack without the deck becoming a debris field, without the air wing being grounded by foreign object hazards, without the whole carefully choreographed machinery of carrier aviation being shut down by its own defensive systems firing. Here is something else worth knowing. You cannot jam a laser. One of the main ways militaries defeat missile systems is electronic warfare. You confuse the missile's guidance system. You spoof its radar. You make it chase a ghost signal instead of a real target. A laser does not have a radar seeker. It does not care about radio frequencies. It travels in a straight line from the emitter to whatever the targeting system has decided to put the beam on. Electronic jamming is completely useless against it. That said, and this is important, a laser is not magic. The beam has limits, and the engineers are very honest about what those limits are. The atmosphere is a problem. Heavy rain scatters the photons. Dense fog absorbs energy before it reaches the target. Ocean salt spray kicked up in rough seas degrades the beam's reach. The Locust works best in clear conditions, and the Navy knows this. It is not a silver bullet. It is a specific tool designed for a specific layer of the defense. The threat layer it handles is the cheap stuff. Group 1 through Group 3 drones, meaning small to medium unmanned aircraft, the fiberglass kamikaze variety that Iran and its allies have been using to overwhelm defenses in places like the Red Sea. It is not burning through the hardened steel nose of a hypersonic cruise missile, diving at 5 times the speed of sound. That is a different problem requiring a different weapon. But here is the thing. Nobody ever said it needed to stop everything. It just needed to stop enough. Why this changes everything. To really understand what the Locust does for the carrier strike group, you need to think about it not as a weapon, but as a savings account. Before the laser, every incoming threat had to be handled by the same limited pool of missiles. A $20,000 fiberglass drone got the same response as a multi-million-dollar hypersonic cruise missile, a $1.5 million interceptor fired out of a tube. The carrier's defensive system could not tell the difference between a nuisance and an extinction-level threat in terms of what it chose to spend on the answer. It fired the same expensive bullet either way. The laser changes the entire calculus by creating a new bottom layer of defense specifically for the cheap threats. Now, when a swarm of 50 fiberglass drones appears on radar, the Aegis combat system does not have to fire 50 expensive missiles. It hands the whole swarm over to Locust and says, "Your problem now." And Locust burns them down one at a time for $5 each, while the escort ship's missile tubes stay completely untouched. Those missiles are now free to do what they were actually designed for, waiting, fully loaded, for the moment a genuinely terrifying threat shows up on screen. A hypersonic anti-ship missile, an advanced ballistic missile coming down at Mach 5 from above, the kind of weapon that actually demands a kinetic response because nothing else will stop it. The ESSM and the RAM and the SM-6 are all still there, fully stocked, when that moment comes. Think about the strategic effect of that. Right now, any adversary trying to plan an attack on a U.S. carrier strike group knows exactly how to start. Send a wave of cheap drones first to drain the missile inventory, then follow up with your real weapons once the defenders are running on empty. It is the same logic as pre-softening a position with artillery before the main assault. Tire out the defense with volume before you land the real blow. Locust eliminates that first wave as a meaningful threat. The cheap drones do not drain anything. They just get quietly burned out of the sky at $5 per engagement while the real missiles wait. The entire strategic logic of the attacker's plan falls apart. There is also a less obvious benefit that the Navy has not talked about as much, but is equally significant. The carrier can now hold its position. In the old math, if a carrier strike group got hit with a sustained swarm attack and the escort ships started burning through missiles, there would come a point where the admiral had no choice but to pull back. Not because the ship was damaged, but because continuing to stay on station with empty missile tubes was just asking to get hit by something it could no longer stop. Retreat was the rational move. With Locust running on nuclear power, the carrier can stay. There is no bottom to the laser's magazine as long as the reactor is running. You can sit in that strait for weeks and burn down every cheap drone anyone sends at you, without once touching the missile inventory. The carrier does not need to retreat. The strategic presence holds. The deterrence holds. And speaking of the nuclear reactor, this might be the most quietly profound part of the whole story. The nuclear reactor on the George H.W. Bush was designed for one purpose: to push a 100,000-ton ship through the water at 30 knots. That is what it has always done. It propelled the carrier. Full stop. The moment Locust plugged into that power grid, the reactor became something new. It became an ammunition factory. A factory with no raw materials to buy, no supply chain to worry about, no resupply ship to rendezvous with in the middle of the ocean. The fuel is already there, already running, already producing electricity around the clock. Turning that electricity into laser shots costs almost nothing. The most energy-rich object in the United States military, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, just got a weapon system that finally knows how to use all that power. The Navy quietly announced in April 2026 that all of this had happened 6 months earlier. And just before that announcement, AeroVironment unveiled the Locust X3, the next generation of the same system, now with artificial intelligence doing the targeting automatically. The AI tracks the drone, identifies it as a threat, calculates the precise point on the airframe to focus the beam, and engages it, all faster than a human operator could even finish reading the sensor data. One operator can oversee the system while it handles an entire swarm autonomously. The progression here is not subtle. From the day the original Locust proved itself in combat tests on Army vehicles, to the moment it proved itself on the deck of a moving nuclear aircraft carrier, to the rollout of an AI-powered third generation that costs $5 a shot and is ready for mass production, the entire arc happened in just a few years. That is an extraordinarily fast development cycle for military hardware, which usually takes decades. It tells you something about how seriously the Navy is taking the drone swarm threat. When the bureaucracy moves fast, it is scared. What comes next? Here is the part of the story that nobody has fully answered yet, and it is the part that should keep naval strategists up at night. The Locust solves the cheap drone problem for today's threat. But the people building those cheap drones are watching and learning. They saw what happened in the Red Sea when Iran-backed Houthi fighters sent wave after wave of drones at U.S. warships and started draining their missile supplies. Now they are going to see that the carrier has a counter to that tactic. So what do? They adapt. They build more drones, and they build them differently. Faster ones. Drones with better airframes that take longer to burn through. Drones that fly in tighter formations so the laser has to slew between targets faster. Drones that come in from multiple directions simultaneously. Drones with reflective coatings that scatter the beam. None of these are science fiction. They are all already being discussed in defense circles as the natural next step in what everyone is calling the drone race. And Iran is not the only player. China has been developing drone carrier ships specifically designed to release massive swarms of aerial, surface, and underwater drones simultaneously against a carrier strike group. Their strategy involves hitting the same carrier from every direction at once, from below with submarines, from above with drones, from the horizon with missiles, while cyber attacks try to confuse the Aegis system trying to manage all of it. American military analysts writing in publications like the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings Journal have been sounding the alarm about exactly this scenario for the past few years. They note that China has rehearsed coordinated drone swarm releases alongside anti-ship missile strikes, pairing high-volume cheap threats with expensive precision weapons in a deliberate attempt to overwhelm the layered defense. The laser takes care of the cheap layer. But if the expensive layer hits at the same moment, the math gets complicated again very quickly. There is also the question of what happens when drone technology gets smarter and cheaper at the same time. Right now, a locust system needs several seconds of dwell time on a single target to bring it down. If someone builds a drone that tumbles unpredictably in flight, or one that is coated with a material that absorbs less laser energy, the dwell time needed goes up. If you need 10 seconds instead of 3, you can burn down a lot fewer drones in a given minute. An attacker who understands this will build drones specifically to exploit it. The Navy is aware of all of this. The move from the original Locust to the X-3 in just a couple of years tells you they are already iterating fast. The X-3's AI targeting system is specifically designed to track and switch between targets faster than any human operator could, which helps when the swarms get bigger and faster. The modular design of the whole system means you can swap out the laser emitter for a more powerful one as the technology improves, without rebuilding the entire container from scratch. The Locust handles one of those threat layers. It does not handle all of them. And that is not a criticism of the system because nothing handles all of them at once. That is just the reality of modern naval warfare, which has become a constant sprint between attack and defense, with each side adapting to the other faster than ever before. What the laser does is buy time. It buys the carrier strike group time to hold its position. It buys the Navy time to develop the next layer of defense. It buys the engineers time to build the next version of Locust, or whatever comes after that, before the swarms get sophisticated enough to overwhelm it. And there is something deeper here about what this moment represents. The supercarrier has been the defining symbol of American military power since World War II. It is the first thing presidents reach for in a crisis. Where are the carriers? Is practically a reflex at this point. But for the past several years, serious military thinkers have been quietly asking whether the supercarrier is becoming too vulnerable to survive in a world where any reasonably funded adversary can build thousands of cheap drones. The Locust does not put that question to rest forever, but it answers it for right now. The aircraft carrier is not obsolete, not yet. Not as long as a nuclear reactor can feed a laser that burns down every cheap drone that comes within range for $5 a pop. The shipping container sitting on the flight deck of the USS George H.W. Bush is not glamorous. It does not look like a weapon. It does not roar or flash or shake the deck when it fires. The sailors who walk past it every day probably still do not know exactly what it is. But that box is the reason the carrier gets to keep doing its job. It is the reason a $6 billion warship can stare down a swarm of $20,000 drones and not flinch. It is the reason the most powerful fleet on Earth did not quietly run out of options. They turned a nuclear reactor into an infinite magazine. And they did it by rolling a shipping container onto a flight deck with a forklift. The future of naval warfare was not announced with fanfare. It was quietly bolted to a deck in the Atlantic Ocean 7 months before anyone was told it had happened. If this blew your mind as much as it did mine, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next video. Turn on notifications because we are going deep into how China's drone mothership strategy is evolving in response to exactly this kind of development. And that story is even more wild. Drop a comment below. Do you think the laser gives the carrier a future? Or is the era of the supercarrier already over, no matter what gets bolted to its deck?